Some people say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when that blood turns cold and family becomes the weapon used to wound you deepest? What happens when the very people who should protect you become the architects of your exile, and the traditions meant to bind you together become the chains that cut you out? My name is Sarah Chen, and this is the story of how my father chose my sister over me for the last time, and how I discovered that sometimes the most devastating revenge comes wrapped in legal documents and signed with a banker's pen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the rolling hills outside Nashville, Sarah had always believed that family meant unconditional love, even when that love came with conditions she was too young to understand. The Chen family lived in a sprawling farmhouse that her great-grandfather had built in the 1940s, complete with wraparound porches, creaking wooden floors, and a kitchen that always smelled of her grandmother's famous five-spice duck. The house sat on 43 acres of Tennessee pasture land, with a small creek running through the back property and enough space for her father's prized horses to roam. Her father, David Chen, was a man of contradictions, tender with animals but harsh with expectations, generous with money but stingy with praise. He had built a successful construction company from nothing, starting with a single pickup truck and ending up with a fleet of equipment and contracts throughout the Southeast. David was the kind of man who believed in hard work above all else, who measured worth in tangible achievements and had little patience for what he called soft pursuits. Sarah's mother, Linda, had been the balance to David's intensity. Where he was rigid, she was flexible. Where he demanded perfection, she celebrated effort. Linda had been a music teacher at the local elementary school, filling their home with the sound of piano lessons and children's laughter. She had a way of making everyone feel heard, whether it was a struggling 6-year-old trying to find middle C or her own daughter practicing violin in the front parlor. The Chen family had always been close-knit, bound together by traditions that stretched back generations. Every Sunday, Linda's mother would come for dinner, bringing stories of the old country and recipes that had been passed down through 4 generations of women. Holiday celebrations were elaborate affairs, with the entire extended family gathering at the farmhouse, filling every bedroom and spreading sleeping bags across the living room floor. But the family dynamic had always been complicated by the presence of Sarah's younger sister, Jessica. Born 3 years after Sarah, Jessica had arrived in the world with a different temperament entirely. Where Sarah was quiet and introspective, Jessica was outgoing and demanding. Where Sarah excelled in academics and music, Jessica struggled with schoolwork but charmed everyone she met with her quick wit and social intelligence. From early childhood, it had been clear that Jessica was David's favorite. She looked more like him, with his strong jawline and confident bearing, while Sarah had inherited Linda's delicate features and gentle demeanor. Jessica shared David's love of horses and machinery, spending hours in the barn helping him with repairs, while Sarah practiced violin or buried herself in books. The favoritism wasn't malicious, but it was undeniable, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways both subtle and obvious. When the girls were young, Linda had been the buffer between David's expectations and Sarah's sensitive nature. She made sure both daughters felt loved and valued, creating special traditions for each of them. Sarah would help in the garden, learning the names of flowers and how to coax tomatoes from stubborn soil. Jessica would go with David to construction sites, wearing a tiny hard hat and learning to identify different types of equipment. The balance worked, more or less, until Sarah turned 16 and Linda was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. The illness came on suddenly, starting with what Linda dismissed as typical middle-aged discomfort and escalating within months to a diagnosis that left the family reeling. Sarah still remembered the day they got the news, sitting in the sterile waiting room of Vanderbilt University Medical Center while David paced and Jessica chewed her fingernails down to the quick. Linda fought the cancer with the same grace she brought to everything else, enduring chemotherapy with a smile and insisting that life should continue as normally as possible. She continued teaching until she physically couldn't stand for a full day, continued hosting family dinners until the smell of food made her nauseated, continued tucking Sarah in at night even when she was too weak to walk upstairs without assistance. Sarah threw herself into caring for her mother, learning to manage medications and coordinate doctor appointments, taking over household responsibilities that Linda could no longer handle. Jessica, overwhelmed by the reality of their mother's illness, retreated into social activities and spent increasingly long hours at friends' houses. David buried himself in work, taking on more contracts and staying at job fights until well past dinner time. The uneven distribution of caregiving responsibilities created the first real rift in the family. Sarah felt burdened and alone, carrying responsibilities that seemed too heavy for her teenage shoulders. Jessica felt guilty about her avoidance, but couldn't seem to force herself to face the reality of her mother's deteriorating condition. David felt helpless in the face of an enemy he couldn't fight with machinery or determination. Linda died on a Tuesday morning in March, just as the dogwood trees were beginning to bloom. Sarah was 18, a senior in high school with early admission to Vanderbilt for music education. Jessica was 15, failing algebra and spending most of her time with a boyfriend David disapproved of. The funeral filled the local Methodist church, with mourners spilling out into the parking lot and stories of Linda's kindness shared until well past sunset. In the months following Linda's death, the family structure collapsed entirely. David, adrift without his wife's emotional guidance, became even more rigid and demanding. He threw himself into expanding the business, working 16-hour days and expecting the same level of dedication from everyone around him. Jessica, freed from her mother's gentle discipline, began staying out past curfew and failing most of her classes. Sarah, caught between grief and responsibility, tried to hold the household together while maintaining her grades and preparing for college. The breaking point came during Sarah's high school graduation. David had promised to close the business early to attend the ceremony, but a crisis at a major job site kept him away until the evening reception. Sarah sat in the auditorium, watching other families celebrate together, while Jessica texted friends, and David's empty seat remained a stark reminder of where his priorities lay. That fall, Sarah left for Vanderbilt with a combination of relief and guilt. She was grateful to escape the tension at home, but worried about leaving Jessica alone with David's increasingly critical attention. College provided a refuge where Sarah could focus on her studies and begin to heal from the trauma of her mother's death without constantly managing family drama. Jessica, left alone with David, began to change in ways that initially seemed positive. She started helping more around the farm, learning to operate machinery, and taking genuine interest in the construction business. David, pleased to finally have someone who shared his passions, began spending more time with Jessica, teaching her about equipment maintenance and bringing her to job sites. What Sarah didn't recognize at first was that Jessica wasn't just learning about the business, she was learning how to manage David. Jessica had inherited their mother's social intelligence, but lacked Linda's ethical grounding. She figured out exactly what David wanted to hear and became expert at providing it. She praised his business acumen, listened attentively to his stories about difficult clients, and gradually positioned herself as his most trusted confidant. By Sarah's sophomore year of college, the transformation was complete. Jessica had become David's partner in ways that went far beyond typical father-daughter activities. She was involved in business decisions, accompanied him to industry events, and had effectively taken over many of the household management responsibilities that Linda had once handled. Sarah noticed the change during holiday visits home. Conversations centered around construction projects and business expansion, topics where Sarah had no knowledge or interest. Jessica spoke knowledgeably about permits and subcontractors, using industry terminology that left Sarah feeling like an outsider in her own family. David's pride in Jessica's involvement was obvious, and his subtle disappointment in Sarah's different interests became increasingly pointed. The dynamic reached a new level during Sarah's junior year when David announced that he was expanding the business into residential development. He had purchased several hundred acres of land outside Nashville with plans to build a luxury subdivision. Jessica, now 18 and supposedly headed to community college, had convinced David to let her defer education to work full-time for the company. Sarah objected to the plan during a tense family dinner, arguing that Jessica needed education and job experience outside the family business. David's response was swift and cutting. He told Sarah that not everyone was suited for academic pursuits, that Jessica had practical intelligence that was just as valuable as book learning, and that Sarah's opinions about the family business weren't welcome since she had no intention of being involved. The conversation ended with Sarah storming out of the house and driving back to campus 3 days early. She didn't speak to David or Jessica for 2 months until Jessica called crying about a breakup with her boyfriend. Even then, their relationship felt strained and artificial, as if they were following a script rather than genuinely connecting. During Sarah's senior year, she received news that surprised and hurt her in equal measure. David had purchased a house for Jessica. Not just any house, but a beautiful colonial in one of Nashville's most desirable neighborhoods. The house was supposedly an investment property that Jessica would manage, but it was clear that it was actually a gift disguised as a business opportunity. The house was everything Sarah had dreamed of for her own future. Hardwood floors, a gourmet kitchen, a music room perfect for teaching private lessons, and a garden with mature landscaping. David had paid cash for the property, avoiding mortgage payments and ensuring that Jessica would have both a beautiful home and valuable real estate asset. Sarah learned about the house through social media, seeing Jessica's Instagram posts featuring the housewarming party that Sarah hadn't been invited to. The photos showed David beaming with pride as he gave Jessica the keys, surrounded by family friends and business associates who offered congratulations on Jessica's business savvy and entrepreneurial spirit. The exclusion stung, but what hurt more was the realization that David had never offered Sarah any comparable support. When she had asked for help with college expenses, he had told her that she could take out student loans like everyone else. When she had mentioned wanting to pursue graduate school in music education, he had suggested she consider more practical career options. Yet Jessica received a house worth over $500,000, handed to her without any apparent strings attached. Sarah graduated from Vanderbilt with honors and a degree in music education, along with $43,000 in student loan debt. She found a position teaching elementary music in Franklin, a suburb south of Nashville, and rented a tiny apartment that ate up most of her modest teacher's salary. The contrast between her financial struggles and Jessica's comfortable situation was impossible to ignore. The relationship between the sisters became increasingly strained as Jessica settled into her new life. Jessica posted constantly on social media about home improvement projects, dinner parties, and business meetings, creating an image of sophisticated success that felt calculated to highlight the differences in their circumstances. She spoke condescendingly about Sarah's noble choice to become a teacher, as if Sarah had chosen poverty rather than following her passion. David's treatment of Sarah during this period was particularly painful. He seemed to view her career choice as a personal rejection of his values and priorities. He rarely asked about her work, showed little interest in her achievements, and made pointed comments about the financial security that Jessica was building through her involvement in the family business. The final insult came during Sarah's second year of teaching when David announced his engagement to Patricia Morrison, a widow he had met through business connections. Patricia was pleasant enough, but her arrival in the family completed Sarah's marginalization. Patricia got along well with Jessica, sharing her interests in entertaining and home decoration, and seemed to view Sarah as an unnecessary complication in the new family dynamic. The wedding was a small affair, held at the farmhouse with mostly business associates and Patricia's family in attendance. Sarah felt like a stranger at her own father's wedding, watching as Patricia seamlessly integrated into the life that had once included her mother. Jessica served as David's unofficial co-host, introducing Patricia to important clients and discussing expansion plans as if she were a full business partner rather than a daughter. After the wedding, Sarah's visits to the farmhouse became increasingly rare and uncomfortable. Patricia had subtly but thoroughly redecorated the house, removing most traces of Linda's influence and creating spaces that reflected her own more formal tastes. Jessica had moved her bedroom into what had been Sarah's childhood room, claiming she needed the larger space for work materials, while Sarah was relegated to the guest room when she visited. The new family dynamic became crystal clear during Sarah's first Christmas after David's remarriage. Sarah arrived at the farmhouse expecting the traditional celebration that had defined her childhood: extended family gathering, elaborate meal preparation, and gift exchanges that stretched throughout the day. Instead, she found that the plans had changed without consultation. Patricia had decided to host a smaller, more elegant celebration, focused on David's business associates and her own adult children from her previous marriage. The guest list included people Sarah had never met, while several of Linda's relatives had been quietly uninvited. Jessica had enthusiastically embraced the new format, spending weeks planning a sophisticated dinner party that bore no resemblance to the casual, chaotic celebrations of Sarah's childhood. The menu featured expensive wines and catered appetizers, instead of Linda's traditional dishes. The gift exchange had been replaced with what Patricia called a more mature approach to holiday giving. Sarah felt like an intruder at what had once been her own family celebration. She didn't know most of the guests, had nothing to contribute to conversations about business expansion and real estate investments, and found herself watching from the sidelines as Jessica played hostess in their mother's former role. The breaking point came when David stood up to make a toast during dinner. He spoke eloquently about the blessings of the past year, praising Patricia for bringing stability to his life and Jessica for her dedication to the family business. He talked about the future of Chen construction, about expansion plans and legacy building, about the satisfaction of seeing his values passed down to the next generation. Sarah waited for her name to be mentioned, for some acknowledgement of her presence or achievements, but it never came. David's toast focused entirely on his real family, Patricia, Jessica, and the business that bound them together. Sarah was omitted not through oversight, but through deliberate exclusion, treated as if she were a distant relative rather than his daughter. The message was unmistakable. Sarah was no longer considered part of the family that mattered. She had made choices that took her outside David's sphere of influence and values, and she was being punished for that independence. Jessica had chosen loyalty and dependence, and she was being rewarded with inclusion, financial support, and emotional intimacy. Sarah left the Christmas gathering early, claiming she had to prepare for classes resuming after the holiday break. No one tried to convince her to stay. Jessica was too busy entertaining guests, Patricia was focused on managing the dinner service, and David seemed relieved to avoid the awkwardness of addressing the obvious tension. Driving home to her tiny apartment that night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She was done trying to earn a place in a family that had already written her out of the story. She was done accepting crumbs of attention and affection while Jessica received the full feast of David's approval and support. Most importantly, she was done pretending that love and loyalty were one-sided obligations. What Sarah didn't know yet was that her exclusion from Christmas dinner would turn out to be David's biggest mistake. Because while Sarah had been busy building a life independent of the family business, she had also been building something else: a deep understanding of finance, real estate, and the legal structures that governed both. Her teaching salary might have been modest, but Sarah had been careful with money in ways that Jessica, cushioned by David's support, had never needed to learn. She had studied investment strategies, learned about mortgage structures, and discovered opportunities that most people overlooked. She had also learned something crucial about the house that David had bought for Jessica, something that would soon give Sarah power she had never imagined possessing. The house that Jessica lived in, the symbol of David's favoritism and Sarah's exclusion, was not as securely owned as everyone believed. David's cash purchase had been structured in a way that left certain vulnerabilities, legal exposures that could be exploited by someone who understood how to navigate the system. Sarah had discovered these vulnerabilities through careful research, motivated initially by simple curiosity about the property records. Now, sitting in her apartment on Christmas night, watching social media posts from the elegant dinner party she had been excluded from, Sarah began to formulate a plan. It would take time, patience, and careful execution, but she was going to teach her family a lesson about the true meaning of loyalty and consequences. Jessica thought she had won the competition for David's affection and support. She thought her beautiful house and comfortable lifestyle were permanent fixtures, guaranteed by her father's love and protection. She was about to learn that security built on excluding others is far more fragile than it appears. David thought he could rewrite his family to exclude the daughter who had disappointed him, replacing her with a new wife and favoring the child who validated his worldview. He was about to discover that children remember how they are treated, and that power dynamics in families are never as permanent as they seem. Sarah had been pushed out of her own family, treated as expendable, and excluded from the traditions that had once defined her identity. She had accepted that exclusion with grace and dignity, building a life that didn't depend on their approval or support. Now she was going to show them exactly what they had thrown away and what it would cost them to learn that lesson. The plan that Sarah began developing that Christmas night would take months to implement, but its foundation was already solid. She had knowledge that Jessica and David lacked, resources they didn't know she possessed, and most importantly, a motivation that had been refined by years of careful exclusion and deliberate dismissal. Jessica's beautiful house, the symbol of everything Sarah had been denied, was about to become the weapon that would change the family dynamic forever. David's assumption that Sarah could be safely ignored and excluded was about to collide with the reality of what his daughter had learned during her years of independence. The Christmas dinner that was supposed to celebrate the new family order, the gathering that had been designed to show Sarah her place outside the circle of love and loyalty, had instead provided Sarah with the final motivation she needed. She was done being the daughter who accepted less, who made do with scraps, who pretended that exclusion didn't hurt. It was time for Jessica and David to learn that when you systematically exclude someone from family love and support, you also exclude yourself from family loyalty and protection. They were about to discover that Sarah had grown stronger during her years in exile, and that strength was about to be turned against the very foundations of the life they built without her. The house that David had bought for Jessica was beautiful, expensive, and perfectly suited to the lifestyle they wanted her to maintain. David's assumption that Sarah could be safely ignored and excluded was about to collide with the reality of what his daughter had learned during her years of independence. The Christmas dinner that was supposed to celebrate the new family order, the gathering that had been designed to show Sarah her place outside the circle of love and loyalty, had instead provided Sarah with the final motivation she needed. She was done being the daughter who accepted less, who made do with scraps, who pretended that exclusion didn't hurt. It was time for Jessica and David to learn that when you systematically exclude someone from family love and support, you also exclude yourself from family loyalty and protection. They were about to discover that Sarah had grown stronger during her years in exile, and that strength was about to be turned against the very foundations of the life they built without her. The house that David had bought for Jessica was beautiful, expensive, and perfectly suited to the lifestyle they wanted her to maintain.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It was also, as Sarah had discovered, built on legal ground that was far less solid than anyone realized, and Sarah was the only one who knew how to make that ground shift. On New Year's Eve, while Jessica hosted another elegant party in her beautiful home and David celebrated the success of his business expansion, Sarah sat in her tiny apartment with a stack of legal documents and a phone number for a foreclosure attorney. The party was about to begin, and this time, Sarah would be the one controlling the guest list. The systematic exclusion that had defined Sarah's relationship with her family was about to become the foundation for a systematic reclamation of power. Jessica's house was just the beginning. David's assumptions about family loyalty were about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. And Sarah, the daughter who had been written out of the family story, was about to write a new chapter entirely. They had taught her that love was conditional, that support was earned through compliance, and that family could be redefined to exclude anyone who didn't fit the desired narrative. Now, Sarah was going to teach them that exclusion works both ways, that power dynamics can shift without warning, and that the children you underestimate are often the ones who pose the greatest threat to the foundations you take for granted. The clock was ticking toward midnight, toward a new year that would bring consequences none of them had anticipated. Sarah raised a glass of cheap wine to her empty apartment and made a toast of her own, to family lessons learned, to debts about to be collected, and to the sweet justice of giving people exactly what they had given her. Nothing at all. The foreclosure papers would be filed on January 3rd. Jessica's perfect life was about to become significantly less perfect. And David, the daughter who had been written out of the family story, was about to learn that when you choose one daughter over another, you better make sure the one you discard doesn't have the power to choose you right back. Sarah had been excluded from Christmas, but she was about to give her family a New Year's resolution they would never forget: that actions have consequences, that exclusion breeds exclusion, and that the daughter they had underestimated was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined possible. The beautiful house that symbolized Jessica's favored status was about to become the symbol of a very different kind of family lesson, and this time, Sarah would be the one teaching it. The first week of January brought an unexpected snowstorm to Middle Tennessee, blanketing Nashville in 6 inches of powder that shut down most of the city. Sarah used the school closure as an opportunity to visit the Davidson County Courthouse, where public records were kept and where her investigation into Jessica's house would begin in earnest. The courthouse was nearly empty, with only essential personnel braving the icy roads. Sarah signed in with the clerk and made her way to the records department, where she had spent considerable time over the past year researching property investments for her own future planning. What had started as simple financial education had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of real estate law, mortgage structures, and the various ways property ownership could be compromised. Sarah had first learned about foreclosure opportunities during a continuing education course she had taken the previous summer. The class, designed for teachers interested in real estate investing, had covered various methods of acquiring property below market value. While most of her classmates had focused on tax sales and distressed properties, Sarah had been intrigued by the complex web of liens, mortgages, and legal encumbrances that could affect even seemingly secure properties. The house that David had purchased for Jessica was located at 4847 Hillwood Drive in the prestigious Belmead area of Nashville. Sarah had driven past it dozens of times since Jessica had moved in, each visit reinforcing her sense of the unfairness that governed their family dynamics. The colonial-style home sat on nearly an acre of manicured lawn, with a circular driveway, 3-car garage, and swimming pool that had cost more than Sarah would earn in 5 years of teaching. What Sarah had discovered through her courthouse research was that David's cash purchase of the house had been far more complicated than the family believed. While David had indeed paid the full purchase price without obtaining a traditional mortgage, he had structured the transaction in a way that left the property vulnerable to certain types of claims. The complexity arose from David's use of business financing to fund the purchase. Rather than using personal savings, David had leveraged assets from Chen Construction to generate the cash needed for the house. This had involved a series of transactions that included business loans, equipment financing, and what appeared to be a sophisticated shell game of moving money between various corporate entities that David controlled. The problem with this approach was that it had created a chain of financial obligations that technically encumbered the house, even though no mortgage appeared on the property deed. David had used construction equipment as collateral for loans that had funded the house purchase, and he had personally guaranteed those loans using both business and personal assets. Sarah's understanding of these financial structures had been enhanced by her relationship with Marcus Williams, a fellow teacher who had left education to work as a commercial loan officer at First Tennessee Bank. Marcus had been helping Sarah understand investment opportunities, and their conversations had evolved into a romantic relationship that provided Sarah with insights into commercial lending practices that most people never encountered. Through Marcus, Sarah had learned about the aggressive collection practices that banks employed when business loans went into default. She had learned about the cascade effect that could occur when interconnected financial obligations become fail, and she had learned about the legal mechanisms that creditors could use to recover their investments when borrowers defaulted. Most importantly, Sarah had learned that David's business was not as financially stable as it appeared from the outside. Chen Construction had taken on significant debt to fund its expansion into residential development, and the company was carrying monthly obligations that required consistent cash flow to maintain. The luxury subdivision project that had been David's pride and joy was behind schedule and over budget, creating financial pressures that David had been careful to hide from his family. Sarah's access to this information had come through Marcus's position at the bank, where Chen Construction maintained several accounts and credit facilities. While Marcus couldn't provide specific details about David's financial situation due to privacy regulations, their conversations about general lending practices had given Sarah enough information to piece together the broader picture. The revelation that had changed everything had come during a casual conversation about problem loans and foreclosure procedures. Marcus had mentioned that banks were becoming increasingly aggressive about pursuing personal guarantees when business loans went into default, particularly in cases where borrowers had used business credit to fund personal investments. That comment had sent Sarah back to the courthouse records with new questions and a different focus. She had spent weeks tracing the financial connections between Chen Construction's various loans and the cash that had been used to purchase Jessica's house. What she discovered was a complex web of financial obligations that created multiple points of vulnerability. David had used a line of credit secured by construction equipment to generate part of the cash for Jessica's house. He had personally guaranteed that line of credit, pledging both business and personal assets as collateral. The line of credit was structured with a variable interest rate that had increased significantly over the past year, and the monthly payments had grown from manageable to burdensome. More problematically, the line of credit contained acceleration clauses that could be triggered if Chen Construction's financial ratios fell below certain thresholds. The residential development project that David had invested heavily in was consuming cash faster than it was generating revenue, and Sarah's analysis suggested that the company was approaching those critical financial ratios. The final piece of the puzzle had come through Sarah's own financial research. She had been building her investment portfolio through careful saving and strategic purchases of distressed debt. Through an investment group that Marcus had introduced her to, Sarah had learned about opportunities to purchase defaulted commercial loans at significant discounts. The investment group specialized in acquiring problem loans from banks that wanted to remove non-performing assets from their balance sheets. The group would purchase these loans for pennies on the dollar, then pursue collection through various means, including foreclosure, asset seizure, and negotiated settlements. What Sarah had discovered was that First Tennessee Bank was preparing to sell several problem commercial loans to reduce their exposure to risky borrowers. Among the loans being offered was the line of credit that David had used to fund Jessica's house purchase. The bank was willing to sell the loan for approximately 30 cents on the dollar, a discount that reflected their pessimism about collecting the full amount from David. The loan amount was substantial, nearly $400,000, but the discounted purchase price would be around $120,000. For Sarah, who had been carefully saving and investing for years, this amount was achievable, particularly with the additional financing that the investment group could provide. The plan that Sarah developed was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. She would purchase David's defaulted loan from the bank, becoming the creditor with legal authority to pursue collection. Since David had personally guaranteed the loan and had pledged both business and personal assets as collateral, Sarah would have multiple avenues for recovery. Most importantly, since David had used the loan proceeds to purchase Jessica's house, and since he had pledged personal assets as collateral, Sarah would have legal standing to pursue foreclosure on the house as a method of loan recovery. The fact that Jessica's name was on the deed would not protect the property from foreclosure if David defaulted on his personal guarantee. The beauty of the plan was that it would be entirely legal and above board. Sarah would be operating as a legitimate creditor pursuing collection of a valid debt. David's financial difficulties were real, not manufactured, and his default on the loan would be the result of his own business decisions rather than any manipulation by Sarah. The irony was exquisite. David had excluded Sarah from the family while simultaneously creating the financial vulnerability that would give her power over their most prized asset. His favoritism toward Jessica had led him to take financial risks that exposed both of them to consequences they had never imagined. Sarah spent the remainder of January finalizing her plan and arranging the necessary financing. The investment group that Marcus had introduced her to was interested in partnering with her on the loan purchase, recognizing that Sarah's personal knowledge of the borrower would be valuable in the collection process. The legal aspects of the plan were handled by Rebecca Martinez, an attorney who specialized in commercial debt collection and foreclosure proceedings. Rebecca had explained the process in detail, ensuring that Sarah understood both the opportunities and the risks involved. The purchase of the loan would give Sarah immediate standing as David's creditor, with all the legal rights that position entailed. If David was unable to pay the loan in full, Sarah would have the authority to pursue collection through various means, including asset seizure and foreclosure. The personal guarantee that David had signed meant that his personal assets, including any real estate he had purchased with loan proceeds, could be used to satisfy the debt. Rebecca had been particularly enthusiastic about the strength of Sarah's legal position. The documentation was clear, the personal guarantee was ironclad, and the connection between the loan proceeds and Jessica's house was well established in the public records. From a legal standpoint, Sarah's case was virtually bulletproof. The timeline for implementation was aggressive but achievable. The loan purchase could be completed within 2 weeks, at which point Sarah would officially become David's creditor.
She would then have the option of demanding immediate payment of the full loan amount, or she could allow David to continue making payments under the existing terms. Sarah's intention was to demand immediate payment, knowing that David lacked the liquid assets to satisfy the debt. This would trigger the foreclosure process, giving Sarah legal authority to seize assets pledged as collateral. The process would take several months to complete, but the outcome would be inevitable unless David could somehow raise $400,000 in cash. The plan would remain secret until the loan purchase was complete and Sarah was ready to make her demand for payment. David and Jessica would continue living their comfortable lives, unaware that the foundation of their security was shifting beneath them. Sarah found herself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions as she prepared to execute her plan. There was satisfaction in the elegant justice of the scheme. David's favoritism and exclusion would be turned against him using his own financial decisions. There was also anxiety about the magnitude of what she was attempting and the permanent damage it would likely cause to their family relationships. Most powerfully, there was a sense of liberation in finally taking action rather than simply enduring the unfairness that had defined her relationship with her father and sister. For years, Sarah had accepted her marginalized position in the family, telling herself that maintaining relationships was more important than fighting for equality. Now, she was done accepting less than she deserved. The loan purchase was completed on February 14th, a timing that Sarah found appropriately ironic. While Jessica was no doubt celebrating Valentine's Day in her beautiful house, unaware that its ownership had just become precarious, Sarah was signing documents that made her the legal creditor for the debt that had funded that house. Rebecca Martinez had handled the transaction with professional efficiency, ensuring that all legal requirements were met and that Sarah's rights as the new creditor were properly established. The investment group had provided the additional financing needed to complete the purchase, accepting Sarah's personal guarantee and a pledge of her future teacher's pension as collateral. The moment when Sarah signed the final documents was both terrifying and exhilarating. She was now personally liable for a substantial debt, but she was also in control of a situation that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in her family. David's financial vulnerability had become Sarah's strategic advantage. The first step in the collection process was to notify David that the loan had been sold and that Sarah was now his creditor. Rebecca had prepared a formal notice that would be delivered by certified mail, informing David of the change in loan ownership and demanding immediate payment of the full outstanding balance.
The notice was scheduled for delivery on February 20th, giving Sarah time to prepare for the confrontation that would inevitably follow. She had no illusions about David's likely reaction to discovering that his daughter was now in a position to foreclose on Jessica's house. Sarah used the intervening days to prepare both practically and emotionally for what was coming. She arranged for time off from work, knowing that the legal proceedings would require her attention. She also prepared herself for the family crisis that would erupt once David understood the implications of her actions. The certified mail receipt arrived on February 21st, confirming that David had received the notice. Sarah's phone began ringing within hours, with calls from David, Jessica, and even Patricia. Sarah let all the calls go to voicemail, knowing that the initial conversations would be emotional and unproductive. David's voicemail messages evolved throughout the day, beginning with confusion, escalating to anger, and finally to panic as he began to understand the legal reality of his situation. Jessica's messages were primarily focused on demanding explanations and accusing Sarah of betrayal. Patricia's single message was brief and cold, suggesting that Sarah's actions were both inappropriate and potentially illegal. Sarah listened to the messages with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The panic in David's voice was particularly gratifying, representing the first time in years that she had seen him face consequences for his choices. At the same time, the raw emotion in the messages reminded her that she was dealing with real people who would suffer real consequences from her actions. The legal notice had given David 30 days to pay the loan in full or face foreclosure proceedings. Sarah knew that David lacked the liquid assets to satisfy the debt, and his business was too leveraged to support additional borrowing. The only viable option for David would be to sell assets, potentially including the farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. Rebecca Martinez had explained that David might attempt to negotiate a settlement or payment plan, but Sarah's legal position gave her significant leverage in any such discussions.
As the creditor, Sarah could accept or reject any proposal David made, and she was under no obligation to be reasonable or accommodating. The power dynamic that had defined Sarah's relationship with her family for years was about to be completely reversed. David, who had always controlled the family through his financial dominance, was about to discover what it felt like to be powerless. Jessica, who had enjoyed the benefits of David's favoritism without considering the costs, was about to learn that privilege could be revoked without warning. Sarah's colleagues at school noticed the change in her demeanor during this period, commenting that she seemed more confident and focused than usual. Sarah deflected their questions about her improved mood, knowing that the full explanation would be difficult for most people to understand or accept. The reality was that Sarah felt more alive and purposeful than she had in years. For the first time since her mother's death, she was in control of her own destiny rather than simply reacting to other people's decisions. The fear and uncertainty that had characterized her relationship with her family had been replaced by the solid satisfaction of holding winning cards in a game she had been losing for far too long. As the 30-day deadline approached, Sarah began receiving more desperate communications from David. He offered to pay the original loan amount plus interest, apparently not understanding that Sarah was now entitled to demand the full accelerated balance. He suggested payment plans that would take years to complete, not recognizing that Sarah had no incentive to accept anything less than full and immediate satisfaction. Most tellingly, David never acknowledged the family dynamics that had led to this situation. His communications focused entirely on the financial aspects of the problem, treating Sarah's actions as a business dispute rather than the consequences of years of favoritism and exclusion. Jessica's communications became increasingly hostile as she began to understand that her house was genuinely at risk. She accused Sarah of jealousy, vindictiveness, and emotional instability. She suggested that Sarah was having some kind of psychological breakdown and needed professional help. Most painfully, she argued that their mother would be ashamed of Sarah's actions. The reference to their mother was particularly galling to Sarah, who remembered vividly how Jessica had avoided Linda during her illness and had shown little interest in preserving her memory after death. Jessica's sudden invocation of maternal authority felt hypocritical and manipulative. Sarah's response to these communications was silence. Rebecca Martinez had advised against any direct contact with David or Jessica during the legal process, and Sarah was happy to follow that advice. She had said everything she needed to say through her actions, and no amount of arguing or pleading would change her determination to see the process through to completion. The 30-day deadline passed without payment, triggering the formal foreclosure process. Rebecca Martinez filed the necessary legal documents, initiating proceedings that would ultimately result in the forced sale of Jessica's house unless David could somehow satisfy the debt. The foreclosure filing was a matter of public record, ensuring that David's financial difficulties would become visible to his business associates, competitors, and clients. For a man who had built his reputation on financial success and business acumen, the public nature of the proceedings would be almost as damaging as the financial consequences. Sarah realized that she had crossed a point of no return. Even if David somehow managed to satisfy the debt and save Jessica's house, the damage to their family relationships would be permanent. She had burned bridges that could never be rebuilt, choosing justice over reconciliation and power over peace. The choice felt right in a way that surprised her. Sarah had spent years trying to maintain family harmony despite being consistently marginalized and excluded. She had accepted unfairness in the name of keeping the peace, had swallowed her pride to preserve relationships that brought her little joy or satisfaction. Now she was prioritizing her own interests and sense of justice, and the relief was enormous. She no longer had to pretend that the family dynamics were acceptable or that David's favoritism was something she should simply endure. She was fighting back, and the satisfaction of that fight outweighed any guilt she might have felt about the consequences.
The foreclosure process would take several months to complete, during which time Jessica could continue living in the house while legal proceedings moved forward. But the outcome was virtually certain unless David could perform a financial miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely. Sarah had achieved something she had never thought possible. She had gained the power to determine Jessica's fate in the same way that David had once determined hers. The daughter who had been excluded from Christmas dinner was now in a position to exclude Jessica from the house that symbolized her favored status.
The irony was perfect, the justice was poetic, and the satisfaction was complete. Sarah had learned the lesson that David had inadvertently taught her, that family loyalty was conditional, that love could be withdrawn, and that power belonged to whoever was smart enough and strong enough to claim it. Jessica was about to learn those same lessons, and David was about to discover that the daughter he had underestimated was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The foreclosure was just the beginning of Sarah's education in family power dynamics, and she was proving to be an excellent student. The beautiful house that had represented everything Sarah had been denied was about to become the symbol of everything Jessica was about to lose, and Sarah, the excluded daughter who had been treated as expendable, was about to demonstrate that exclusion could work both ways. The foreclosure notice appeared in the Davidson County legal announcements on March 15th, a small but significant entry that would forever alter the Chen family dynamics. Sarah read the notice online from her apartment, feeling a surge of satisfaction as she saw Jessica's address listed among the properties scheduled for public auction. The legal machinery was now in motion, with deadlines and procedures that would proceed regardless of family emotions or personal appeals. Rebecca Martinez had explained that the foreclosure process in Tennessee typically took 4 to 6 months from filing to final sale, assuming no successful legal challenges or last-minute payments. During this period, the property would remain under legal scrutiny, with court-appointed appraisers determining its fair market value and establishing the minimum bid for the public auction. Jessica could continue living in the house, but she would do so knowing that each day brought her closer to losing everything she had taken for granted. The psychological impact on the family was immediate and devastating. David's reputation in the construction industry began to suffer as word of the foreclosure spread through the tight-knit community of contractors, suppliers, and real estate professionals. Several clients postponed projects citing concerns about Chen Construction's financial stability, which created additional cash flow problems that compounded David's difficulties. Jessica's response to the public foreclosure notice was to mount an increasingly desperate campaign to pressure Sarah into withdrawing her legal action. She enlisted Patricia as an intermediary, apparently believing that another woman might be more successful in appealing to Sarah's emotions. Patricia's approach was sophisticated and manipulative, focusing on themes of family unity, forgiveness, and the greater good. She called Sarah repeatedly, leaving lengthy voicemails that painted David as a proud man who had made mistakes but who loved both his daughters equally. She spoke about the importance of family legacy and the tragedy of allowing legal disputes to destroy relationships that could never be repaired. The calls became increasingly emotional as Patricia realized that Sarah was not responding to appeals based on sentiment or guilt. Patricia began sharing details about the impact the foreclosure was having on David's health, describing sleepless nights and stress-related medical symptoms that were affecting his ability to work. Most calculatively, Patricia began talking about Noah, Jessica's 3-year-old son, whose existence Sarah had learned about through social media rather than direct communication from the family. Patricia painted vivid pictures of a confused child who would lose his home through no fault of his own, becoming an innocent victim of adult conflicts he couldn't understand. The strategy might have been effective with the old Sarah, the daughter who had absorbed family dysfunction for years in the name of keeping peace. But the woman who had orchestrated this foreclosure was no longer motivated by the desire to minimize conflict or protect other people's feelings at her own expense. Sarah's silence in response to these appeals was deliberate and strategic. Rebecca Martinez had advised against any communication that might be construed as negotiation or willingness to compromise. More importantly, Sarah recognized that engagement would only encourage more manipulation and emotional blackmail. The truth was that Sarah felt no particular sympathy for Noah's situation. Jessica had chosen to have a child with a man she barely knew, had chosen to build her life around financial dependence on David's favoritism, and had chosen to exclude Sarah from family events, including the child's birth and early years. The consequences of those choices were Jessica's responsibility, not Sarah's. David's response to the foreclosure was more complex and evolved through several distinct phases as he gradually accepted the reality of his situation. Initially, he had focused on finding alternative financing to pay off the debt, contacting banks and private lenders in search of emergency loans that would allow him to satisfy Sarah's demand. The problem he encountered was that his existing debt load was already substantial, and the foreclosure proceedings had damaged his creditworthiness in ways that new borrowing nearly impossible. Banks that had previously competed for his business were now reluctant to return his phone calls, let alone approve significant new loans. David's second approach was to liquidate business assets, selling equipment and vehicles to raise cash. This strategy generated some funds, but fell far short of the amount needed to satisfy the debt. Moreover, selling essential equipment hampered his ability to complete existing projects, creating additional financial pressures that made his situation worse rather than better. As David exhausted his conventional options, he began exploring more desperate alternatives. He approached private investors with proposals to sell equity stakes in Chen Construction, offering ownership percentages that reflected his desperation rather than the company's actual value. These negotiations proved fruitless, as sophisticated investors recognized the distressed nature of his situation and either declined to participate or made offers that would have left David with minimal control over his own company. David's mounting desperation led him to make a decision that would prove to be a crucial mistake. He decided to confront Sarah directly, despite Rebecca Martinez's warnings that such contact could constitute harassment or intimidation. The confrontation took place on a Saturday morning in early April, when David appeared unannounced at Sarah's apartment complex. Sarah was returning from her weekly grocery shopping when she found him leaning against her car in the parking lot, looking haggard and defeated in a way she had never seen before. The conversation that followed was the first direct communication between father and daughter since the foreclosure proceedings had begun, and it revealed the vast gulf that now separated their perspectives on family, loyalty, and justice. David began with anger, accusing Sarah of destroying the family out of spite and jealousy. He characterized her actions as those of a vindictive child who was punishing innocent people for perceived slights. He accused her of lacking compassion and understanding, of being willing to sacrifice family relationships for the sake of petty revenge. Sarah's response was calm and measured, reflecting months of preparation for this inevitable confrontation.
She pointed out that David had excluded her from family events, had shown favoritism toward Jessica throughout their lives, and had made it clear that Sarah's opinions and needs were irrelevant to family decisions. When David attempted to minimize these grievances as normal family dynamics, Sarah became more specific. She reminded him of the Christmas dinner where he had toasted everyone except her, of the house he had bought for Jessica while Sarah struggled with student loans, of the business opportunities he had provided Jessica while dismissing Sarah's achievements as unimportant. David's response revealed the depth of his inability to understand Sarah's perspective. He argued that Jessica had earned his support through her involvement in the family business, while Sarah had chosen a different path that naturally led to different treatment. He seemed genuinely confused by Sarah's suggestion that equal treatment should be independent of career choices. The conversation became more heated as David realized that Sarah was not interested in negotiating or finding a compromise solution. He offered various concessions, including promises to treat Sarah more fairly in the future, to include her in family events, and to provide financial support for her education or career development. Sarah's rejection of these offers was absolute and non-negotiable. She pointed out that David's promises were worthless given his history of favoritism and exclusion. More importantly, she explained that the foreclosure was not a negotiating tactic designed to extract concessions. It was a consequence that David had earned through his choices. The moment when David finally understood that Sarah was serious about following through with the foreclosure was visible in his physical reaction. The color drained from his face as he realized that his daughter possessed both the legal authority and the personal determination to destroy Jessica's life and damage his own reputation permanently. David's final appeal was to blood relationship and family history, reminding Sarah of the love and support he had provided during her childhood, before the family dynamics had become complicated by Linda's death and his remarriage. He spoke about their shared memories, about fishing trips and construction site visits, about the pride he had felt in her academic achievements even if he hadn't always expressed it effectively. Sarah's response to this emotional appeal was the most devastating blow she could have delivered. She acknowledged that David had been a good father during her early years, but she pointed out that good behavior in the past did not excuse bad behavior in the present. She explained that love and support were not deposits in a bank account that could be withdrawn indefinitely without consequences. Most importantly, Sarah told David that he had taught her valuable lessons about family dynamics through his treatment of her after Linda's death. He had shown her that love was conditional, that support was based on compliance with his expectations, and that family relationships could be redefined to exclude anyone who didn't fit the desired narrative. Sarah explained that she was simply applying those same principles in reverse. Just as David had excluded her from the family when her choices disappointed him, she was now excluding him and Jessica from her consideration when making decisions about the foreclosure. Just as David had shown that family loyalty was conditional, Sarah was demonstrating that her own loyalty was equally conditional. The conversation ended with David storming away, apparently convinced that Sarah had become a stranger whose motivations and values were completely foreign to him. What he failed to understand was that Sarah had become exactly what he had taught her to be, a person who understood that power relationships within families were subject to change, and that consequences for bad behavior were sometimes delayed but never eliminated entirely. Jessica's reaction to learning about the failed confrontation was to escalate her own campaign of emotional manipulation and public pressure. She began posting on social media about family loyalty and forgiveness, sharing carefully curated content that painted her as a victim of Sarah's unreasonable vindictiveness. The social media campaign was sophisticated and manipulative, featuring photos of Noah playing in the garden of the house that was now under foreclosure threat, accompanied by captions that spoke about the importance of family stability and the tragedy of adults allowing their conflicts to harm innocent children. Jessica also began reaching out to extended family members, friends, and community leaders who might have influence with Sarah. She contacted Sarah's colleagues at school, her former professors at Vanderbilt, and even members of Linda's family who might be willing to intervene on behalf of family unity. The strategy backfired because it revealed the extent to which Jessica was willing to manipulate others in service of her own interests. Many of the people she contacted were uncomfortable with being drawn into family drama, and some began to question Jessica's version of events when they learned more about the background circumstances. More problematically for Jessica, the public nature of her campaign brought additional attention to the foreclosure proceedings and David's financial difficulties. Potential clients who might not have known about Chen Construction's problems became aware of them through Jessica's own social media activity, further damaging David's business reputation. The legal proceedings continued to move forward according to their established timeline, with court-appointed appraisers determining that Jessica's house had a fair market value of approximately $650,000. This valuation was higher than Sarah had expected, reflecting both the desirable location and the improvements that Jessica had made to the property. The higher valuation meant that the foreclosure sale would likely generate enough proceeds to satisfy Sarah's debt claim with a substantial surplus remaining. Under Tennessee law, any surplus from a foreclosure sale would be returned to the property owner after all liens and legal costs were satisfied. This financial reality introduced a new dynamic into the situation, because it meant that Jessica would not lose everything even if the foreclosure proceeded to completion. She would lose the house and be forced to relocate, but she would receive a cash payment that could fund the purchase of different property or provide financial security for her and Noah. Rebecca Martinez explained to Sarah that the surplus provision somewhat weakened the impact of the foreclosure as a punitive measure. While Jessica would face the disruption and embarrassment of losing her home, she would not face complete financial ruin as Sarah had initially expected. Sarah's response to this information was to adjust her strategy accordingly. Rather than viewing the foreclosure purely as a financial punishment, she began to focus on the psychological and social consequences that would result from Jessica losing the house that symbolized her favorite status within the family. The house had been more than a residence for Jessica. It had been proof of David's love and support, evidence of her special position within the family hierarchy, and a symbol of the security that came from being the preferred daughter. Losing the house would strip away those psychological benefits, even if Jessica's financial situation remained manageable. David's business difficulties continued to mount throughout the spring, as the foreclosure proceedings drew public attention to his financial problems. Several major clients canceled projects, citing concerns about Chen Construction's ability to complete work on schedule and within budget. Suppliers began demanding cash payments rather than extending credit terms, further straining the company's cash flow. The residential development project that had been David's pride and joy became a particular source of stress as construction delays and cost overruns mounted.
The project had been financed through a complex arrangement of bank loans, investor partnerships, and pre-sales to future homeowners, all of which were now threatened by David's deteriorating financial situation. In May, David was forced to halt construction on the development entirely when his primary lender called in the loan facility that had been funding the project. The banker explained that David's personal financial difficulties, as evidenced by the foreclosure proceedings, had triggered cross-default provisions that allowed the bank to demand immediate repayment of all outstanding obligations. The shutdown of the development project was covered in the local business press, with articles that detailed Chen Construction's financial problems and speculated about the company's future viability. What he failed to understand was that Sarah had become exactly what he had taught her to be, a person who understood that power relationships within families were subject to change, and that consequences for bad behavior were sometimes delayed but never eliminated entirely. Jessica's reaction to learning about the failed confrontation was to escalate her own campaign of emotional manipulation and public pressure. She began posting on social media about family loyalty and forgiveness, sharing carefully curated content that painted her as a victim of Sarah's unreasonable vindictiveness. The social media campaign was sophisticated and manipulative, featuring photos of Noah playing in the garden of the house that was now under foreclosure threat, accompanied by captions that spoke about the importance of family stability and the tragedy of adults allowing their conflicts to harm innocent children. Jessica also began reaching out to extended family members, friends, and community leaders who might have influence with Sarah. She contacted Sarah's colleagues at school, her former professors at Vanderbilt, and even members of Linda's family who might be willing to intervene on behalf of family unity. The strategy backfired because it revealed the extent to which Jessica was willing to manipulate others in service of her own interests. Many of the people she contacted were uncomfortable with being drawn into family drama, and some began to question Jessica's version of events when they learned more about the background circumstances. More problematically for Jessica, the public nature of her campaign brought additional attention to the foreclosure proceedings and David's financial difficulties. Potential clients who might not have known about Chen Construction's problems became aware of them through Jessica's own social media activity, further damaging David's business reputation. The legal proceedings continued to move forward according to their established timeline, with court-appointed appraisers determining that Jessica's house had a fair market value of approximately $650,000. This valuation was higher than Sarah had expected, reflecting both the desirable location and the improvements that Jessica had made to the property. The higher valuation meant that the foreclosure sale would likely generate enough proceeds to satisfy Sarah's debt claim with a substantial surplus remaining. Under Tennessee law, any surplus from a foreclosure sale would be returned to the property owner after all liens and legal costs were satisfied. This financial reality introduced a new dynamic into the situation, because it meant that Jessica would not lose everything even if the foreclosure proceeded to completion. She would lose the house and be forced to relocate, but she would receive a cash payment that could fund the purchase of different property or provide financial security for her and Noah. Rebecca Martinez explained to Sarah that the surplus provision somewhat weakened the impact of the foreclosure as a punitive measure. While Jessica would face the disruption and embarrassment of losing her home, she would not face complete financial ruin as Sarah had initially expected.
For David, who had built his identity around business success and community respect, the public nature of his difficulties was almost as painful as the financial consequences. Sarah read these articles with a mixture of satisfaction and surprise at the extent of the collateral damage her actions had caused. She had expected the foreclosure to affect Jessica directly and David peripherally, but the interconnected nature of his business and personal finances had created a cascade of consequences that threatened his entire professional empire. The realization that she had this level of impact was both empowering and sobering. Sarah began to understand that her position as David's creditor gave her influence that extended far beyond Jessica's house, potentially affecting the livelihoods of dozens of people who worked for Chen Construction and depended on the company's success. This broader perspective forced Sarah to confront questions about the morality and proportionality of her actions. She had set out to teach David and Jessica a lesson about the consequences of favoritism and exclusion, but the lesson was proving more expensive than she had anticipated. Rebecca Martinez helped Sarah navigate these ethical considerations by focusing on the legal reality of the situation. David's financial problems were the result of his own business decisions and risk-taking, not Sarah's foreclosure action. The foreclosure was simply exposing vulnerabilities that already existed, rather than creating new problems.
Moreover, Rebecca pointed out that Sarah had not initiated David's financial difficulties. She had simply positioned herself to benefit from them when they became apparent. David's decision to use leveraged financing to purchase Jessica's house had created the vulnerability that Sarah was exploiting, but the vulnerability had been David's creation, not Sarah's. In June, with the foreclosure sale scheduled for late July, David made one final attempt to resolve the situation through direct negotiation with Sarah. This time, however, he approached the meeting with a different strategy, acknowledging his mistakes and accepting responsibility for the family dynamics that had led to Sarah's actions. The meeting took place at Rebecca Martinez's office, with both parties represented by legal counsel to ensure that any agreement would be properly documented and enforceable. David came accompanied by his own attorney, a bankruptcy specialist who had been helping him explore options for restructuring his debts and preserving Chen Construction. David's opening statement was dramatically different from his earlier confrontational approach. He acknowledged that he had shown favoritism toward Jessica throughout their lives, admitted that he had excluded Sarah from family events and decisions, and accepted responsibility for creating the family dynamics that had led to the current crisis. More importantly, David offered a comprehensive settlement that would address not only the immediate debt obligation, but also the underlying family issues that had motivated Sarah's actions. The settlement included immediate payment of Sarah's debt claim, a formal apology to be read at a family gathering, and a restructuring of family financial arrangements that would provide Sarah with equal treatment going forward. The financial terms of David's offer were substantial. He proposed to satisfy Sarah's debt claim through a combination of cash payment and transfer of ownership in a commercial property that Chen Construction owned outright. The property was a small office building that generated steady rental income and had a value slightly higher than Sarah's debt claim. Additionally, David offered to establish a trust fund for Sarah's benefit that would match the value of the house he had purchased for Jessica. The trust would be funded through the sale of business assets and would provide Sarah with long-term financial security that was equivalent to the support Jessica had received. The personal terms of the settlement were equally significant. David committed to treating both daughters equally in all future family matters, including inheritance planning, business opportunities, and social events. He agreed to establish regular family meetings where both daughters would have equal voice in family decisions, and he committed to seeking family counseling to address the underlying relationship problems that had created the current crisis. Sarah's initial response to the settlement offer was skeptical, reflecting her long experience with David's promises and her understanding of his tendency to revert to old patterns when immediate pressure was removed. She questioned whether David's newfound understanding of family dynamics was genuine or simply a tactical response to the threat of financial ruin. Rebecca Martinez advised Sarah to consider the settlement carefully, pointing out that it would provide her with substantial financial benefits while avoiding the uncertain outcome of a foreclosure sale. More importantly, the settlement would establish legal obligations that would be enforceable even if David's personal commitment to change proved temporary. The negotiations continued for several days as the parties worked through the details of the proposed settlement. Sarah insisted on modifications that would strengthen the enforcement mechanisms and provide additional protections against future favoritism. She also demanded that Jessica be required to acknowledge her role in excluding Sarah from family events and to commit to more inclusive behavior going forward. Jessica's participation in the settlement negotiations was reluctant and defensive. She continued to characterize Sarah's actions as disproportionate revenge for minor family disagreements, and she resisted accepting responsibility for the exclusionary behavior that had contributed to the current crisis. The breakthrough in negotiations came when Sarah's attorney introduced a concept that reframed the entire discussion. Rather than viewing the settlement as Sarah's acceptance of David's apology, the attorney suggested that it should be understood as David and Jessica's acceptance of Sarah's terms for continued family relationship. This reframing shifted the power dynamic in ways that acknowledged Sarah's current position of strength and made clear that any ongoing family relationship would be based on her conditions rather than their preferences. David and Jessica were not offering Sarah the opportunity to rejoin their family. They were requesting permission to remain in Sarah's family. The final settlement agreement was signed on July 20th, 5 days before the scheduled foreclosure sale. The terms were complex and detailed, reflecting the complexity of both the financial and personal issues that had led to the crisis. Financially, Sarah received immediate payment of her debt claim, plus accrued interest and legal costs. She also received ownership of the commercial property David had offered, which would provide ongoing rental income, and the establishment of a trust fund that would ensure her long-term financial security that was equivalent to the support Jessica had received. The personal terms of the settlement were equally significant. David committed to treating both daughters equally in all future family matters, including inheritance planning, business opportunities, and social events. He agreed to establish regular family meetings where both daughters would have equal voice in family decisions, and he committed to seeking family counseling to address the underlying relationship problems that had created the current crisis. Sarah's initial response to the settlement offer was skeptical, reflecting her long experience with David's promises and her understanding of his tendency to revert to old patterns when immediate pressure was removed. She questioned whether David's newfound understanding of family dynamics was genuine or simply a tactical response to the threat of financial ruin. Rebecca Martinez advised Sarah to consider the settlement offer carefully, pointing out that it would provide her with substantial financial benefits while avoiding the uncertain outcome of a foreclosure sale. More importantly, the settlement would establish legal obligations that would be enforceable even if David's personal commitment to change proved temporary. The negotiations continued for several days as the parties worked through the details of the proposed settlement. Sarah insisted on modifications that would strengthen the enforcement mechanisms and provide additional protections against future favoritism. She also demanded that Jessica be required to acknowledge her role in excluding Sarah from family events and to commit to more inclusive behavior going forward. Jessica's participation in the settlement negotiations was reluctant and defensive. She continued to characterize Sarah's actions as disproportionate revenge for minor family disagreements, and she resisted accepting responsibility for the exclusionary behavior that had contributed to the current crisis. The breakthrough in negotiations came when Sarah's attorney introduced a concept that reframed the entire discussion. Rather than viewing the settlement as Sarah's acceptance of David's apology, the attorney suggested that it should be understood as David and Jessica's acceptance of Sarah's terms for continued family relationship. This reframing shifted the power dynamic in ways that acknowledged Sarah's current position of strength and made clear that any ongoing family relationship would be based on her conditions rather than their preferences. David and Jessica were not offering Sarah the opportunity to rejoin their family. They were requesting permission to remain in Sarah's family. The final settlement agreement was signed on July 20th, 5 days before the scheduled foreclosure sale. The terms were complex and detailed, reflecting the complexity of both the financial and personal issues that had led to the crisis. Financially, Sarah received immediate payment of her debt claim, plus accrued interest and legal costs. She also received ownership of the commercial property David had offered, which would provide ongoing rental income, and the establishment of a trust fund that would ensure her long-term financial security that was equivalent to the support Jessica had received. The personal terms of the settlement were equally significant. David committed to treating both daughters equally in all future family matters, including inheritance planning, business opportunities, and social events. He agreed to establish regular family meetings where both daughters would have equal voice in family decisions, and he committed to seeking family counseling to address the underlying relationship problems that had created the current crisis. Sarah's initial response to the settlement offer was skeptical, reflecting her long experience with David's promises and her understanding of his tendency to revert to old patterns when immediate pressure was removed. She questioned whether David's newfound understanding of family dynamics was genuine or simply a tactical response to the threat of financial ruin. Rebecca Martinez advised Sarah to consider the settlement offer carefully, pointing out that it would provide her with substantial financial benefits while avoiding the uncertain outcome of a foreclosure sale. More importantly, the settlement would establish legal obligations that would be enforceable even if David's personal commitment to change proved temporary. The negotiations continued for several days.
Marcus Williams, the bank officer who had helped Sarah understand the commercial lending practices that made her plan possible, had become a romantic partner whose respect for Sarah's intelligence and determination formed the foundation of their relationship. Their shared interest in real estate investing provided common ground for building a partnership that was based on mutual benefit rather than traditional gender roles. The teaching career that had once defined Sarah's identity remained important to her, but it was no longer her only source of purpose and satisfaction.
The financial security that her settlement had provided gave her the freedom to focus on the aspects of teaching that she found most rewarding rather than simply working to pay bills and service student loans. Sarah began to develop plans for eventually leaving classroom teaching to focus on educational consulting and private tutoring, using her financial independence to create a career that would provide more flexibility and potentially higher income. The foreclosure experience had taught her that she was capable of strategic thinking and execution that could be applied to many different types of challenges. The relationship with Noah continued to be the most rewarding aspect of the new family dynamic, as Sarah was able to provide her nephew with attention and resources that enriched his life while creating genuine bonds of affection. Sarah found herself thinking about the lessons she wanted to teach Noah about fairness, respect, and the importance of treating people equally regardless of their usefulness or compliance. Jessica's parenting of Noah was generally competent, but Sarah noticed that Jessica was already beginning to show favoritism toward her son in ways that echoed David's treatment of Jessica herself. Sarah made a mental note to watch for opportunities to intervene if this pattern became problematic, knowing that she now had both the legal standing and the family influence to protect Noah's interests if necessary. The house that had been the center of the foreclosure action remained a symbol of the changed family dynamic, but its meaning continued to evolve as time passed. For Jessica, it was a daily reminder of the fragility of the security she had taken for granted. For Sarah, it was proof that family power structures could be challenged and changed through strategic action and careful planning. David's relationship with the house was perhaps the most complex, as it represented both his love for Jessica and the costly mistakes he had made in expressing that love. He had learned that providing material support without ensuring emotional fairness could create vulnerabilities that threatened everything he had worked to build. The family gatherings that were now required by the settlement agreement were formal and somewhat artificial, but they provided structure for maintaining relationships that might otherwise have been abandoned entirely. Sarah attended these events with a sense of satisfaction rather than enthusiasm, knowing that her presence was now valued and respected, even if it was not necessarily welcomed with genuine warmth. The Christmas celebration that marked the first anniversary of the settlement was particularly significant, as it represented the complete reversal of the exclusion that had motivated Sarah's original actions. This time, Sarah was not only included, but was consulted about menu planning, gift arrangements, and guest lists. The difference between this Christmas and the previous year's celebration was stark and obvious to everyone present. Sarah's position within the family hierarchy had been fundamentally altered, and the deference that David and Jessica now showed her reflected their understanding of the consequences that could result from treating her unfairly. As Sarah reflected on the year that had passed since she first learned about Jessica's Christmas exclusion tactics, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the justice she had achieved. The foreclosure action had been more successful than she had dared to hope, not only in achieving her immediate goals, but in teaching broader lessons about respect, equality, and the importance of treating family members fairly. The woman who sat at the Christmas dinner table as an honored and respected family member was fundamentally different from the excluded daughter who had driven home alone the previous year. Sarah had learned that she possessed capabilities and strength that she had never fully recognized, and that knowledge had transformed not only her family relationships, but her entire sense of what was possible in her life. The foreclosure papers that had once represented Sarah's weapon against family injustice now sat in a safety deposit box as a reminder of what she had accomplished and what she was capable of achieving when motivated by a clear sense of purpose. The legal documents were no longer needed as threats, but they remained as proof that Sarah was not someone who could be safely ignored or mistreated. David's toast at this Christmas dinner was very different from the one that had excluded Sarah the previous year. This time, he spoke specifically about his gratitude for both of his daughters, acknowledging Sarah's intelligence and determination as qualities that had helped the entire family learn important lessons about fairness and respect. Jessica's response to the toast was appropriately gracious, though Sarah could see the effort it required for her sister to publicly acknowledge her own mistakes and Sarah's legitimate grievances. The artificial nature of Jessica's gratitude was obvious, but the fact that she was willing to express it publicly represented progress in the family dynamic. The settlement that had resolved the foreclosure crisis had created a new family structure that was more equitable and sustainable than the previous arrangement, though it lacked the warmth and spontaneous affection that had characterized the family during Sarah's childhood. Sarah had gained respect and equal treatment, but at the cost of any possibility for genuine emotional intimacy. The trade-off felt appropriate and worthwhile to Sarah, who had learned that respect was more valuable than affection when the affection was conditional and unreliable. She preferred honest relationships based on mutual benefit and clear expectations to manipulative relationships based on sentiment and emotional blackmail. As the evening concluded and Sarah prepared to return to her apartment, she felt a sense of completion and satisfaction that had been missing from her life for years. The long process of achieving justice within her family was complete, and the new dynamic that had emerged was stable and sustainable. The foreclosure action that had begun as an act of revenge had evolved into something more constructive, a fundamental restructuring of family relationships that protected everyone's interests while ensuring that favoritism and exclusion would not be tolerated. Sarah had not only achieved justice for herself, but had created a framework that would protect future generations of the family from similar problems. The lesson that Sarah took from the experience was that justice was possible, even in situations that seemed hopeless, but that achieving justice required careful planning, strategic thinking, and the willingness to accept the costs that came with challenging established power structures. The daughter who had been excluded from Christmas dinner had used that exclusion as motivation to fundamentally alter the family dynamic in ways that would prevent future exclusions. The house that symbolized Jessica's favorite status remains Jessica's home, but its meaning had been permanently transformed. Rather than representing unconditional love and support, it now represented conditional privilege that could be revoked if Jessica failed to maintain respectful relationships with all family members. Sarah's apartment, by contrast, had become a symbol of independence and self-determination. The space that had once felt cramped and limiting now felt like a foundation for a life that was entirely under Sarah's control, free from the manipulation and favoritism that had characterized her family relationships in the past. The foreclosure documents that had made everything possible remained in Sarah's possession as both a reminder of what she had achieved and a warning to anyone who might consider treating her unfairly in the future. The legal documents were no longer needed as threats, but they remained as proof that Sarah was not someone who could be safely ignored or mistreated. David's toast at this Christmas dinner was very different from the one that had excluded Sarah the previous year. This time, he spoke specifically about his gratitude for both of his daughters, acknowledging Sarah's intelligence and determination as qualities that had helped the entire family learn important lessons about fairness and respect. Jessica's response to the toast was appropriately gracious, though Sarah could see the effort it required for her sister to publicly acknowledge her own mistakes and Sarah's legitimate grievances. The artificial nature of Jessica's gratitude was obvious, but the fact that she was willing to express it publicly represented progress in the family dynamic. The settlement that had resolved the foreclosure crisis had created a new family structure that was more equitable and sustainable than the previous arrangement, though it lacked the warmth and spontaneous affection that had characterized the family during Sarah's childhood. Sarah had gained respect and equal treatment, but at the cost of any possibility for genuine emotional intimacy. The trade-off felt appropriate and worthwhile to Sarah, who had learned that respect was more valuable than affection when the affection was conditional and unreliable. She preferred honest relationships based on mutual benefit and clear expectations to manipulative relationships based on sentiment and emotional blackmail. As the evening concluded and Sarah prepared to return to her apartment, she felt a sense of completion and satisfaction that had been missing from her life for years. The long process of achieving justice within her family was complete, and the new dynamic that had emerged was stable and sustainable. The foreclosure action that had begun as an act of revenge had evolved into something more constructive, a fundamental restructuring of family relationships that protected everyone's interests while ensuring that favoritism and exclusion would not be tolerated. Sarah had not only achieved justice for herself, but had created a framework that would protect future generations of the family from similar problems. The lesson that Sarah took from the experience was that justice was possible even in situations that seemed hopeless, but that achieving justice required careful planning, strategic thinking, and the willingness to accept the costs that came with challenging established power structures. The daughter who had been excluded from Christmas dinner had used that exclusion as motivation to fundamentally alter the family dynamic in ways that would prevent future exclusions. The house that symbolized Jessica's favorite status remains Jessica's home, but its meaning had been permanently transformed. Rather than representing unconditional love and support, it now represented conditional privilege that could be revoked if Jessica failed to maintain respectful relationships with all family members. Sarah's apartment, by contrast, had become a symbol of independence and self-determination. The space that had once felt cramped and limiting now felt like a foundation for a life that was entirely under Sarah's control, free from the manipulation and favoritism that had characterized her family relationships in the past. The foreclosure documents that had made everything possible remained in Sarah's possession as both a reminder of what she had accomplished.
The relationship represented the possibility for genuine family connection based on affection and mutual benefit rather than obligation and manipulation. As Sarah looked toward the future, she felt confident that the lessons she had learned from the foreclosure experience would serve her well in other areas of her life. The strategic thinking and careful planning that had enabled her to challenge her family's treatment could be applied to career advancement, investment decisions, and personal relationships. The teaching position that had once been Sarah's primary identity had become just one element of a more diversified and secure life that included property management, investment planning, and ongoing oversight of family relationships. The financial independence that the settlement had provided gave Sarah options and flexibility that she had never experienced before. The commercial property that symbolized Sarah's victory in the foreclosure action continued to generate steady income while appreciating in value, providing both immediate cash flow and long-term wealth building. The property served as a daily reminder that Sarah's actions had real and lasting consequences, and that she was capable of achieving financial success through careful planning and strategic execution. The family dynamic that had emerged from the settlement was more formal and structured than the relationships of Sarah's childhood, but it was also more equitable and sustainable. The favoritism and exclusion that had characterized David's treatment of his daughters had been replaced by a system of clear expectations and mutual accountability that protected everyone's interests. Sarah's position within this new family structure was one of strength and respect rather than marginalization and exclusion. Her opinions were sought and valued, her presence was required at family events, and her interests were protected by legal agreements that provided real enforcement mechanisms. The transformation from excluded daughter to family power broker had required Sarah to develop capabilities and confidence that she had not known she possessed. The experience had taught her that she was capable of strategic thinking, legal navigation, and emotional resilience that could be applied to many different types of challenges. The house that had started as a symbol of Jessica's favorite status had become a more complex symbol, representing both the fragility of privilege and the importance of maintaining respectful relationships with all family members. Jessica's continued residence in the house was now contingent on her willingness to treat Sarah as an equal family member, creating accountability that had not existed under the previous family dynamic. The settlement agreement that had resolved the foreclosure crisis had created a new framework for family relationships that was more explicit and formal than traditional family structures, but also more protective of individual interests and more resistant to manipulation and favoritism. The legal enforceability of the agreement provided security that emotional promises had never offered. As the second Christmas under the new family arrangement approached, Sarah felt a sense of stability and satisfaction that had been missing from her life for years. The justice she had achieved was real and lasting, and the respect she had demanded was genuine and consistent. The foreclosure action that had begun as an act of desperation had evolved into a comprehensive restructuring of family relationships that protected everyone's interests while ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Sarah had not only achieved justice for herself, but had created a framework that would benefit future generations of the family. The lesson that David and Jessica had learned about the consequences of favoritism and exclusion was reinforced by their daily awareness of Sarah's capacity to disrupt their lives if they reverted to their previous patterns of behavior. The respect they showed Sarah was motivated by practical considerations as much as genuine affection, but the result was the same. Sarah was treated as an equal family member whose interests and opinions mattered.
The investment in commercial real estate that had begun with the settlement property continued to grow as Sarah applied the financial knowledge she had gained during the foreclosure process to additional opportunities. Her portfolio provided both current income and long-term security that enhanced her independence and flexibility. The teaching career that had once been driven by financial necessity had become a choice based on personal satisfaction and professional interest. The financial security that Sarah had achieved allowed her to focus on the aspects of education that she found most rewarding while maintaining the option to pursue other opportunities as they arose. The relationship with Marcus Williams had evolved into a partnership that provided both emotional support and practical collaboration in building wealth and achieving shared goals. Their relationship was based on mutual respect and common interests rather than traditional romantic dependence, creating a foundation that Sarah found more reliable and satisfying than conventional relationship models. The family gatherings that were now required by the settlement agreement had become opportunities for Sarah to demonstrate her changed status within the family hierarchy while maintaining the relationships that provided her with access to Noah and connection to family history. The artificial nature of some family interactions was an acceptable price for the respect and equality that Sarah had achieved. The legal documents that had made the foreclosure action possible remained in Sarah's possession as both a reminder of her capabilities and a deterrent to anyone who might consider treating her unfairly in the future. The papers represented proof that Sarah was not someone who could be safely ignored or marginalized, and that family relationships based on exclusion and favoritism were vulnerable to challenge and change. The house that had been the center of the foreclosure controversy remained a symbol of the transformed family dynamic, though its meaning continued to evolve as time passed and new patterns of interaction developed. For Sarah, the house represented proof that family power structures could be challenged and changed through strategic action and careful planning. The commercial property that Sarah had received as part of the settlement continued to appreciate in value while generating steady rental income, providing both immediate financial benefits and long-term wealth building. The property served as a tangible reminder of what Sarah had accomplished and what she was capable of achieving when motivated by clear goals and strategic thinking. As Sarah reflected on the journey from excluded daughter to family power broker, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the justice she had achieved and the lessons she had learned about the nature of family relationships and the importance of demanding respect rather than simply hoping for it. The foreclosure action had been more successful than she had dared to hope, transforming not only her family relationships but her entire understanding of what was possible in her life. The woman who now enjoyed equal treatment and respect within her family was fundamentally different from the daughter who had been excluded from Christmas dinner 2 years earlier. Sarah had learned that she possessed strength, intelligence, and determination that could be applied to any challenge she chose to face, and that knowledge had transformed every aspect of her life. The future that stretched ahead of Sarah was filled with possibilities that had not existed before the foreclosure action created new opportunities and demonstrated new capabilities. The financial security, family respect, and personal confidence that she had achieved provided a foundation for pursuing any goals she chose to set for herself. The lesson that family loyalty was conditional and that respect had to be earned and maintained was one that would serve Sarah in all areas of her life. She had learned that accepting unfair treatment in the name of keeping peace was ultimately self-destructive, and that demanding equality was sometimes the only way to achieve genuine respect and lasting relationship stability. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.